Hey guys, Mr. Thibodeau here. So let's go ahead and talk about our history here. So we start off with Thomas Jefferson. I love hate Thomas Jefferson. He is both a very interesting character. He really, really was against government overreach and big federal government, and yet he oversaw the biggest government overreach and the biggest expansion of executive power of the time and of for like the biggest in like 100 years. Like, well, it's not until more modern times that the federal government grew to the way that it did. So even though he complained about slavery and thought that it should be gotten rid of, and yet he also owned slaves, and as far as we know, coerced some of his slaves into a sexual relationship with him and fathered children. Whether or not that was, um, you know, willing or unwilling on behalf of the slave women is hard to say. You know, he owned them; they had to do what he said. So it's really hard to say whether or not that was coercion or not. Um, so we don't really know the relationship dynamics between the two of them. But we do know that for all of his bluster talking about removing slavery, he owned slaves, lots of them, lots and lots. Um, and so he's an interesting character because he tries really, really hard, but also fails really hard in different ways. Or he says one thing, he rallies against Alexander Hamilton about government overreach and big government, and then he with the Louisiana Purchase expands the federal government more so than any other president for the next 100 years. So really interesting character. Really goes back and forth on things. You can love him, you can hate him for a lot of different reasons. But it is funny that he is held up by libertarians today for his what he said about government overreach, but they conveniently forget that he, with the Louisiana Purchase, caused the biggest growth in the federal government and the biggest power change to the federal government for about 100 years. So, because there's nowhere in the Constitution that says that the U.S. federal government can buy land like it did, but he made. I mean, he saw a good deal. The Louisiana Purchase was an excellent deal for the United States. But in buying it, he essentially changed the power structure and changed what a president could or could not do. So really interesting how a lot of his stuff, his Declaration of Independence that he writes. If I was his teacher, I might get him in trouble for copying. He takes a lot from John Locke. Now, is it copying or is it an illusion? Now, realistically, it's an illusion. He is referencing John Locke. John Locke, if we remember, over in the Glorious Revolution, way, way back here, John Locke was the one who wrote about how it is okay for the king of the Duke of Orange and his wife to take over the English government and to become king because of the king was not using his powers correctly. He was not fulfilling his oaths. So John Locke writes about the rights of man and how if there is an unjust government, it is just for the people to overthrow it. Okay, and so in the 1600s, they have the Glorious Revolution in England, where the king is taken down and a new king is put in his place. So 100 years later, when the colonists are like, "Hey, this King George guy is being a real jerk, and he's not letting us do the things we want to do. He's not letting us have our freedoms." Now, granted, some of the things that the colonists want to do is fight Native Americans and take their land, but they have other things as well. Um, so he is going to quote John Locke almost verbatim in a lot of ways. Okay, and in fact, he writes, um, Thomas Jefferson takes directly from John Locke, and he says that we hold these rights, certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. That's what John Locke wrote. That's what Thomas Jefferson wrote. It was Benjamin Franklin that's like, no, no, no. Well, we don't need to be so overt that it's the pursuit of property. Let's say the pursuit of happiness. Let's change the script a little bit. And I really like that change. It's not just property, but happiness. And happiness can mean a lot of different things as an inalienable right. So really interesting times. These were a lot of guys who really, really saw these French intellectualists and the number of English intellectualists who were arguing for the rights of man, not the rights of God, not the rights of the king who is put in place by God, but the rights of man to do what man is going to do, and the right of science. These are children of the Renaissance. These are people who really, really believed in the ability of humankind to overcome and to do great things. Keep in mind, Thomas Jefferson is not a Christian in the way that modern Christians are, okay? It's unclear whether or not he believed Jesus was divine. From all we know, he was a deist who believed that God built the world, set it in motion, and then just left and just watches from afar but does not intervene. So he'll mention God in certain ways, much like even an atheist might say, God bless you. But he does not believe in church being mixed up with state, right? That's how you get the king who's divinely inspired, who is put there by God. So he doesn't believe that, because if he believes that, then their revolution is against God, and he's not going to go that far. Really interesting. You find him misused by a lot of people today who will use him for whatever means they want. A lot of people on the far right love to talk about him, but they don't seem to understand this was a very complicated man who went back and forth in a lot of things. So I hate him. He's great in some things, terrible in other things. I wish he had actually gone ahead and been better with African Americans. But anyway, let's see. So Declaration of Independence, really important. Really intellectual stuff. These guys are trying to create their dream government. Now, some of the things that they're really worried about is they want to cover their own bases. They're really, really concerned about their ability to do what they don't want to be breaking the law. So they establish a government where it's okay to take down tyranny. And it's okay when the government is not supporting the unalienable rights of man, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that people have to toss off that government, okay? Whenever the forms of government becomes destructive of these ends, is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, okay? So people get really big into this, especially folks who want to change our current government. So lots of stuff going on here. American Revolution. Bitter winter at Valley Forge. A few things to talk about here. Valley Forge is interesting. Okay, this is the army under George Washington has just been beaten senseless twice. We've lost two pretty big battles. And George Washington goes to winter at Valley Forge. And they are 20 miles from the British. The British are pretty close, right? You could walk 20 miles in a day if you were determined, right? So the British are like a day away, and yet they wait the whole winter just kind of in a standstill. Few things to know about this. One, I want to talk about the bare feet. I want to talk about the sickness and the desperation, the disease. It is not until World War II that we will have a war that more people will die on the battlefield than they die from illness. World War I, Spanish American War, the Revolutionary War, Civil War, every recorded war that we have, as far as we can tell, more people die from illness, from disease happening amongst themselves than they die from fighting. Okay? Not as many people die from the fighting and the shooting and the killing each other as many people die from just getting sick. Okay? When you bring people from all over your country together, all of these young people together, and they're working together and they're running through the rain and they're fighting in the mud, they're going to get sick. And those illnesses from all over the empire or all over the country or all over the state, and they get together, those diseases spread to people who have never had diseases before. It's usually the rural folks, actually, who join the army and die from the disease more than the city folks. City folks have a little bit more resistance because they're used to being around people. This is where vaccinations are really important. It wasn't until George Washington does mandate vaccines, actually technically not a vaccine, but inoculation for a few diseases. He mandates it for his troops because he knows that more people die from disease than they die from being shot at. Okay, it does help significantly, but they don't have, influenza vaccines. They don't have vaccines for all kinds of different diseases, but they have a few different things such as smallpox and a few others that they have sort of figured out. Now, these were live virus vaccines or inoculations where you're given a weakened version of the virus, and you could get sick from it, much more so than what we have today. Anyway, still, it's that's when it changes around, and suddenly fewer. This is the beginning of it, where fewer people are dying by disease, but it still won't be until World War II that we actually have more people dying by the enemy than by diseases. Even with all of the massive death in World War I, more people still died from diseases and the Spanish flu than from enemy bullets and bombs. Okay, so enough about that. The other important thing to know about is these two guys here, okay? We have Nathaniel Green, who is super important in getting supplies, okay? And we have a Friedrich von Steuben, okay? Now, he is a Prussian army commander, okay? If you want really, really regimented, tight armies, the Prussians, the Hessians, the Germans, very well respected, okay? At this point, Germany, as we know it, does not exist. It won't exist until right after the American Civil War, when Friedrich von Bismarck will take over and unite all of Germany. At this point, it's a bunch of different groups. Anyway, but they are very well-trained military force, though small. Anyway, so he comes and he actually teaches the Americans how to fight, okay? Military tactics, I've said before, we make fun of a lot, the whole stand in a line and fire, because it seems stupid. But the point is, these people would not have done it if it was stupid. You don't go in there and you choose the stupidest form of fighting. Based on how inaccurate those guns were, it was all about standing in a line and firing, because that's when you were able to just create essentially a wall of lead against your opponent and just knock them down faster. Running around, firing, and like hiding, you're probably going to miss most of the time if you're not all in a wall firing together. And your bullet's just going to be wasted. Then if you're running around and you're hiding and you're not in a line, most of the fighting really happened when you did the charge and you fought with your bayonet. So if you were spread out hiding behind different things, you were going to get destroyed when a line of soldiers with their bayonets came. They would do the murder to you. Okay. So these tactics, they seem silly now. For the guns that they had, for the times that they had, they were excellent. It's about this time that things are changing because rifling is becoming a thing, but there's still going to continue to be the tactics of the field until the 1900s. For another 100 years, these tactics are basically going to be critical. The Civil War is going to change it. Napoleon War is going to change it a little bit, but it's really not until World War I that these tactics change drastically. And that's with the machine gun and actually accurate rifles. We got mercenaries, defensive war. I want to really, when you're reading through this and you're seeing how they went here and then over here and did this and did that, I really want to point out the skill of men like Alexander Hamilton. Some people dislike Alexander Hamilton because he did start New York's first bank, or the not New York's first bank, but the Bank of America, the actual bank for United States, the Federal Reserve. Some people dislike that. That's a whole different argument, a whole different thing. He was an exceptionally good secretary. Okay, and that may sound weird because we think of secretary as someone who is writing stuff down. But a secretary in war is exceptionally important because they're the ones who are controlling information, getting stuff out, making sure people know what's going on. If you don't have a telephone, if you don't have internet, you have to do everything by hand. You have to send couriers out to run and tell people different things. The English fail because they are not they're not talking to each other, and they don't have the same information that the colonists have. The colonists, because this is their home territory, they are able to send messages to and from each other much easier. The British are going to fail because of lack of communication. Okay, this Battle of Saratoga fails because who is it? Howe, I think. Howe goes ahead and he heads towards Pennsylvania as opposed to fighting with St. Leger. Okay, and because of that, we get our first big successful battle at Saratoga, which is where the French decide, okay, these guys can actually win. We should support them. Okay, and it's specifically, I will not mince words here. We win the Revolutionary War not because we beat Britain, but because the French entered the war. When the French enter the war, the British realize that they have to protect their most valuable assets. And I'm going to tell you this right now. At the time, America was not that valuable. Okay, the Spice Islands and their trade routes over there were far, far more lucrative. Okay, America was fine. Tobacco, very little cotton at the time. Wood, a little bit of food. America was fine, but for lots of fur. But for the most part, that's not where the money is coming from. That's not the very valuable stuff. So the English want to hold it, but they don't care as much about their other territories. And when the French begin to threaten the other territories, that's when the English are going to capitulate and allow Americans to have their own country. One other thing I want to talk about, and this is a much sadder thing, more African Americans join the British than they join the Americans. Okay, the Americans are still, slavery isn't quite what it will become in the 1800s. It's not the biggest thing just yet. It's pretty big. But what's going to happen is the British are going to promise freedom to enslaved folks if they fight. And a lot of slaves are going to, a lot of African Americans, at this point, they're just Africans really, um, are going to escape and go to the British and join them. The British are going to arm them, treat them well, and at the end of the war, the English take them with them. They take a number, any of the African Americans who fought for the British are going to be brought back to England. Now, here's the thing that kind of reminds me that America is not always the best. Um, America sued England after the war and said, hey, you took a bunch of our slaves from us. We want them back. And England could have just sent those same African Americans who fought on their side, fought for the British, back to America to be slaves again. But England didn't. And this is one of the things that, England did right. England instead sent money back and said, okay, here's money for them instead. We won't give you back these people. These people fought for us, and they have their freedom now. Now, England has its own terrible history with slavery, but this is something that is, they should get props for, where they did keep their promise to keep them safe. It's also why a lot of the Mohawks are going to join and the Native Americans are going to join the English. The Mohawks were smart. They realized that the English were the ones keeping the colonists from expanding, from trying to take more Native American territory. Now, keep in mind, the Iroquois is a group of Native American folks. Okay, the Mohawks are just one group. Now, these are the same Mohawks that fought against the colonists before, or fought for the colonists and prevented Powhatan from taking over. And here they are now fighting for the British. So, bit of a reversal. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. A lot of stuff here, college level courses in here. Lots of information. But hopefully you guys had fun. Anyway, have a good one. Bye.